right, guys. Well, first off, happy Easter to everybody. We've got Landman Life here. Got the intern sitting there running the computer today. We've got the Tulsa boys over here. Have y'all fixed your audio yet?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, man.
All right, it's fixed.
Good to have you on the show, man.
Yeah.
We have our special guest waiting here. We've got Henry Martin, who is running for Congress in Missouri. Henry, can you hear us?
Oh, I can. Yes. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, sir. Great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Do you want to give us a quick rundown of kind of what you're running for and maybe a little bit of the reasons that you're running for Congress?
Mm-hmm. I am running in Missouri's 6th Congressional District. Basically my platform is simple. It's we're running on healthcare, justice, and our democracy. Healthcare because every person deserves access to care, and no American family deserves to go broke from the onset of a major illness or injury. Justice, because the words equal justice under the law can't just be words that we say, but they need to be words with actions. Actions such as environmental justice, economic justice, social justice, reforms to our criminal justice system as we look to rethink how we're doing these things. And of course, our democracy. We've seen how fragile our democracy can be. We need to shore up our democracy and make sure that we no longer take for granted the one thing that we've inherited that we cherish so much. I got in this race because, well, I basically don't see where all the people of my district are represented. The current occupant of the seat, he votes no on things that probably should get a yes because they're good for the 6th Congressional District. It's simple. If you break it down, if it's good for the 6th District, it should get a yes vote. If it's good for the state of Missouri, it should get a yes vote. If it's good for the United States of America, it should get a yes vote. The partisan wrangling in Congress that's going on right now it's through the roof, and it's unfortunate that this is where we are. We deserve better representation. We deserve people who are willing to govern, not people who are willing to go to Washington, try and preserve their seat, and rule over all of us.
Well, I think that there's a lot to unpack there. I think there's a lot of stuff that most of us would agree with, that the political system seems to be headed in a direction that people are no longer looking out for their constituents and are more interested in keeping their political careers moving forward. And so I don't think any of us on the show today would argue with that. But, one of the reasons that we wanted to have you on the show was to, this is a oil and gas kind of energy focused show. And we just kind of wanted to have an open discussion with you about some of the energy policies and see what your thoughts were on a couple of key items, that are issues that are facing our country and the world currently. And so I think, Scott, did you have a couple of talking points that you might want to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, we can start with kind of how we got to this point, inviting you on the show. And again, thanks for your service in both the military and being a public school teacher. My mother was a public school teacher. My in-laws are public school teachers. It's not an easy job for sure. So thanks for that. And then, so basically we saw a post where possibly somebody from California, some kind of government official, was maybe bashing oil and gas guys for profiting during these times and wanting to kind of go after some of our people in our industry for, call it profiteering, for lack of a better word. But kind of want to start with that is Um, what were your thoughts on that? I mean, is it something that's just a lack of education of how the commodities trade, how things work? Is it, oil's bad all the way around and there's no way of getting around that? Or what's your thoughts on that?
Well, first and foremost, I think everybody just needs to lower the temperature a little bit when we start getting into the whys and the whats and how these things happen. Um, yes, the oil's future markets. That's part of the price and part of the market. What did I hear? I heard the expression "rockets and feathers" the other day. I don't
Right.
know. I don't know how much profiteering is actually going on because the price of oil is dropping back to normal, but the price of gas isn't coming down as quickly. So there's that issue. So there, people get into their minds a frame where they look at it and say, okay, this is affecting me directly. So everybody's looking for a solution. There's
Yeah.
no one person to blame. You can blame the president all you want to. You can blame Vladimir Putin all you want to. Speculation has always been a part of the oil and gas industry. So that's just part of that's baked into the cake. Um, the question needs to be, what are we going to do to ease these tensions over time? What are we going to do to transition so that these things don't hit us so hard in the future?
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And think if I can gather my thoughts on this, it's kind of maybe a lack of education on the part. We'll take the blame for it as an industry that we're not very good at going out to the public, the general public, and educating people on how oil and gas works, the
Hmm.
things you need from oil and gas, what part it plays in your life. And if we're not out there being a voice for our own industry, that's our fault. So we
Hmm.
really can't get upset at people for maybe bashing us because of this or that. But and just like any industry, there's good and bad players. There's guys that aren't in it for the right reason. There's guys that don't care about the environment. The vast majority of us do. We do
Hmm.
try to do the right things. We do follow the regulations. We basically have to. And I think part of the reason we're in this situation is you've got policies or talk of policies that are anti oil and gas to the point that the capital that we need as an industry to provide this cheap energy and to give people the lifestyles they need or want is basically not coming into the industry because of that. So I think the politics, if we want to start with that, is playing a role in not allowing capital or even young talent to come into the industry because we've got this black eye that we're some world killing, environmental destroying industry. In actuality, we do all we can to help with that. It's just kind of how it is. Plus, we provide a lifestyle for people that without us would not be available.
Mm. Yeah, well, I had old First Sergeant Koenig. He used to say, he said, Henry, he said, 10,000 attaboys is ruined by one all crap. And of course, he's a first sergeant, so he didn't use crap.
Right.
I'm trying to, and I'm trying to be politically correct here,
Right.
or at least polite, because I don't want to offend too many of your listeners. They may get offended by some of the things I say anyway. Um, so it's one black eye that can hurt an entire industry. Um, at the same time, we do know that energy is one of our national security issues, and so we have to be looking at all forms of energy production in the United States in order to achieve that real energy independence. When we say we're going to put all our money in one basket, that's just crazy talk. Because right now, you can't just say we're going to go all wind and solar. No, you can't do that. Oh, we're going to go all nuclear. Can't do that. We're going to go all in on oil and gas. Can't do that either. So each of these industries has a responsibility to the environment and to the people it serves. As I looked into, one in I have run before. As I looked into the situation previously, I did notice that the production of solar panels was very toxic, and I was afraid. My fear is that we trade one form of pollution for another form of pollution.
Right.
And so I think as these technologies evolve and we're able to get into some of these alternative areas, that these alternative areas should be explored for sure, and they should be adopted. In all of these areas, we can have something of a symbiotic situation where everybody is getting a little bit of something out of it, and no one group is seeing astronomical profits. I think one of the things that scares that frustrates people largely, and perhaps you all can speak to this, and we can speak to it on your show here, is that they get frustrated when they hear there are subsidies for oil and gas producers, and so they hear about the absorbent salaries of oil and gas CEOs and whatnot. I do understand that there's a tremendous amount of responsibility that goes with being the CEO of a large corporation. But where I think voters and the general public gets frustrated is they see the astronomical amounts of money that's pulled out of oil and gas, and yet they're looking in their neighborhoods, they're looking at the cost of gas, and they're like, we are shouldering the burden at the pump and through our tax dollars. So people get frustrated. And so that's where a lot of the frustration comes from in the oil and gas industry, from the generic public.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. I mean, it's almost comparatively to say maybe the CEO of Apple, the amount of money that individual makes, and I have to buy a cell phone that now costs me $1,500, and I mean it's kind of all the same, but they continue to do it because it's in their mind it's needed, just like oil and gas is needed. They'll continue to fill up their tanks. And again, back on there's bad players. There are lots of CEOs of oil companies who do make too much money for what they've done to that particular company or to the industry. And on our show and our little Twitter community that we're in, we try to call out those bad players the best we can. We try to point the finger at them. We try to, maybe jab them a little bit to kind of let them know, hey, this isn't right. You get paid too much money to run an oil and gas company in the ground and to treat your employees a certain way and do certain things. And so, I think just largely we need to have these kind of conversations between opposite sides. And I think from what I can tell, I have family members on both sides. Most people are more centrally located. We're kind of both on the fence. We're not so far right or left, but all you hear is so far right or left. And I think
Hmm.
that's kind of the problem. That's where you said, maybe we need to cool down and try to sit here and educate people and say, hey, look, we're all trying to do the right thing and trying to get together. We just got to call out the bad players, and there's got to be repercussions for those people. I mean, there's got to be some kind of accountability for the bad oil and gas guys and the guys who are pushing green energy that are using large government subsidies to do so,
Hmm.
tax breaks and funding. And on the oil and gas side, maybe Landman Life could speak to this on the subsidy side. Really, the stuff that I see is more on a tax break for
Hmm.
drilling wells. There's marginal well tax stuff. There's things that help produce oil and gas by incentivizing it by a tax break,
Hmm.
less a government writing a check to an oil company saying, here's $20 million to go drill wells. It doesn't
Hmm.
really work like that. So that's kind of a common misconception that these subsidies are more tax incentive based versus just checks written to oil and gas companies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And the pushback there becomes, and we make the assumption that tax cuts and tax deferments don't really cost anything,
Right.
when in essence that's revenue that could be coming in. And so this is where there's a lot of confusion, and people are miss the mark sometimes. We have, yes, I agree. There's a lot of this stuff that the government can't does do to help keep the price down. So, and for that, that is appreciated. And so I do understand I understand what the purpose of all that is for.
Right.
Um, but to the general public, all they see is their pain at the pump, and they're looking for somebody to blame.
Right.
And everybody's always looking for somebody to blame. And the piece that we need to do is say, okay, be let's all be accountable for our actions.
Right.
And I just saw David said that government doesn't need more revenue; they need fiscal responsibility. And while I agree with that statement 100%, it's not about more revenue or less revenue. The cost of doing business, as you all know, well, being in business, it is constant. It's a constant, and sometimes it's linear. So it can go up at a steady rate, and so you all know that's a necessary evil. And so the difference between government and a company is that a government is trying to operate revenue neutral, i.e., it's not trying to make any money and it's not trying to lose any money. And so, but the government has expenses that it has for services that it provides. What those services take the form of our court system, our roads, our schools, and so on and so forth, social services and whatnot. And these investments that the government makes in us, the people of the United States, and in certain corporate activities, these investments are important. And so we I do understand that there are some pet projects that could probably be curtailed. That's just one of those things, and some people be uncomfortable with projects. But services that the government provides directly to the people to improve their lives or to guarantee that opportunity, why should those things be cut?
Right.
And that's and so when we're talking about balancing budgets, the quickest way to balance a budget or to cut revenue is to cut the revenue to the people, to the place where you're not going to see the direct data, is in you're not going to see the hard data directly or immediately. You're going to see the soft data. That's the difference between qualitative and quantitative information. If I
Right.
can see something that's not a quantitatively giving me a return, it's easy for me to make that cut. It's easy for me to suggest that cut. But if the qualitative data comes back, which comes later, 5 to 10 years down the road, that qualitative data for a program that got cut comes back and says that program was actually very beneficial, but we cut it 5 years
Right.
ago. And so now we're seeing another problem in communities and so on and so forth. So yes, I do agree. We have to be responsible with the people's money, but that responsibility, and sometimes our people who are the most vulnerable, they're the people who are least likely to be able to write a maximum donation check to a campaign, so their voice is not heard.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so they
It's a
we
money game,
yes.
and we get that. And I think to your point of seeing a result from tax breaks or programs that use tax funding to help society or help communities, oil and gas is very similar with the tax breaks we get. It takes a lot to drill an oil and gas well, to get a
Hmm.
lease, to produce it. There's a lot that goes into it. It's not a valve you open up and everybody's happy.
Oh
It's a
yeah.
lot more complicated, and I think that's what you see with the tax incentives. Some people might call them subsidies for oil and
Hmm.
gas. It's going to, you need that to generate the energy so you don't have these high prices, right? So if
Hmm.
you look at giving the companies, oil and gas companies, a tax break to go drill these marginal wells or go drill these wells wherever, then you will see an ease in pricing. But you have to pair that with a political environment that allows capital to flow into the industry. Where if you say oil and gas is bad, they make all this money, they get all these government subsidies, so you just hammer us where when we need money to go drill these wells that take 4 to 5 years to see the results of them,
Hmm.
that type of stuff, that's the stuff we got to stop doing. We got to educate the people and say, hey, look, there are some bad players. There's some guys making a ton of money that shouldn't. We need to call them out. We need to point them out. We need to say, hey, that's wrong, and we need to do something about it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is we need the government's tax breaks, subsidies, for us to produce some of this energy. It's American-based energy. It's better for our security. All that stuff plays into. We've got to try to work together on this issue and not try to fight each other the whole way through. Yes, climate change, there's all this kind of stuff they like to use. And I get that, but no one's willing to sacrifice their lifestyle to change the climate. They're just pointing the finger at us saying, hey, you guys are destroying the climate. You need to stop. But they don't stop driving. They don't stop going to Wendy's and buying a Happy Meal. They don't do all those kind of things. And really, that's where capitalism and the flow of money will work. If everybody thinks climate change is such a problem and we're the bad guys for it, then they have to reset their lifestyle. They have to ride a bike. They have to do things that reduce the amount of consumption of oil and gas. And the largest consumption's in fuel.
Yeah.
Can't go see grandma in Kansas. Can't go fly on a plane around the world to take an Instagram photo. You can't do all those things without oil and gas. And these are the types of people that I feel like are most concerned about the climate change. And you hear the big ones, the Greta's and Leonardo and all those, and they have yachts and ride on trains and do all kinds of stuff that consume large amounts of fossil fuels. Yet they preach to all their people that, hey, these guys are bad. You need to not support them. And that's kind of the narrative we want to change. That's through education, through talks like this. We want to try to change the narrative that oil and gas guys aren't bad. Oil companies aren't bad. Yeah, there's bad players, but we need to work together to solve this problem. And it's kind of starts with policy and policy change, and the political environment towards our industry helps money flow in, which then turns into wells drilled, which then turns into production, which supply demand comes into effect. There's more supply to meet the demand, then prices come down. And that's kind of the simplest way I can put it.
Well, and on that I understand. And there are short-term investments that can be made at the public level, like in public infrastructure, for things like rail systems, for high speed rail that would be generally electric, and things of that nature that can help in the long term. But we have to be willing to make those short-term investments. Despite the opposition to the Build Back Better plan itself, it does have significant plans in there, or it did have significant plans in there for the reimplementation of rail systems, commuter rail systems, to get around, to try and alleviate some of exactly what we're talking about, those emissions we're talking about. But we have to make those upfront investments to be able to get people out of their cars. We have to remember that in the 1950s, it was General Motors. Well, it was actually the big three that came through,
Yep.
particularly here in the Midwest, and bought up all of the trolley lines and shut them down.
Yep. I was
Uh,
just going to mention that,
yeah.
that they did a big push to
So
make,
that was
yep.
because they're basically guaranteeing customers. So here in the Midwest, we did not see, except for a handful of places like Chicago and Detroit, we didn't see those investments in that rail infrastructure that our largest cities have. So they're able to have people commuting in New York City. People commute all the way from Connecticut to come into New York City and
Right.
work, because the rail system is so strong there. And if we had those things, and having lived in Germany myself, seeing firsthand, I didn't need a car in Germany because the trains got me everywhere I needed to go. Trains and buses got me everywhere I needed to go.
Yeah. It's
So,
excellent over there. Yep.
so yeah, though these are the things that we as Americans haven't been exposed to specifically. So yes, I realize that yes, there is a necessity for oil and gas. There just is, you know, and over the long term, can there be a combination of oil and gas, solar, wind, and so on and so forth? We can make that transition, but right now we have to make those short-term investments in the oil and gas industry to see to it that we can make those transitions. And yes, it's will they be the billion-dollar industries that they are now? Who knows? Who
Right.
knows? 50 years from now,
So
they may
we
curtail a little.
We're here in San Antonio, Texas,
Mm-hmm.
and last year in February we saw exactly what happens when investment in the fossil fuel industry is deprioritized, when the government subsidies and everything start shifting towards a focus on wind and solar.
Mm-hmm.
And as Scott was mentioning at the start of our discussion, the capital follows the path of least resistance. And so when there are government subsidies available, huge tax incentives, huge tax breaks for building out large scale wind and solar projects, whether the demand for that power or whether the actual capability of producing reliable energy during the times when it's needed are there or not, companies are going to take advantage of those opportunities. So in Texas, we produce more wind and solar power than any other state in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And we also produce more oil and gas than any other state in the United States. When the winter storm was, everybody knew this was going to be a bad storm. Nobody knew exactly how bad. Uh, the state of Texas asked for an exemption from the Department of Energy. So the Department of Energy has a federal standard that requires that a certain percentage of all available power during your 24-hour period has to come from renewables if the capacity is available from renewable sources. If a state were to produce more energy during one of those time periods from fossil fuels, which would be coal or natural gas, they are going to be they're going to be subject to a much higher rate for their energy pricing. So when we're talking about subsidies, the subsidies go to the American people. They are not actually going to oil and gas companies. So when you start talking about cutting out subsidies, basically the state of Texas had a decision to make, and it was, we either potentially bankrupt a lot of citizens of the state of Texas over this storm because everyone is going to be paying for extremely high rates for their electricity during the storm. Would the grid have actually collapsed? Probably not. That was something that everyone was debating in Austin. They decided they could not take the risk of charging everyone in the state of Texas across the board a higher rate for their energy. People can't afford to have a $1,200 energy bill for the month of February. Most people can't afford that. So they said, well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to abide by the federal regulations right now and hope the storm isn't as bad as it turns out to be. So when the wind and the solar stopped producing, we were not running at full capacity with our coal or natural gas power plants. As a result, the vast rural areas of Texas where a lot of our oil and gas production takes place, those electric companies shut off those parts of the grid because they were not a priority, since people don't live out in the middle of nowhere. They prioritized keeping the grids on in the cities. So when you shut off the wellheads where the gas is produced, naturally you're going to not have enough gas in your pipelines to keep running all of your compressor stations and all of that. Once those started turning off, well, your natural gas power plants don't have gas to run on, so they start shutting off. The coal power plants that we could have run at 100% capacity during the storm, the coal stockpiles were freezing. and couldn't be used. And so the focus on keeping the renewables running was, one of the main issues that started the um, complete failure of the electric grid here in Texas. And Texas is a very unique case because our electric grid is isolated from the rest of the country. However, I think that it is a great example because Texas produces, again, more renewable energy and more fossil fuel energy than any other state in the country. And so if that can happen here, I don't understand why anyone thinks that can't happen on a if we had a, nationwide weather event. Um, I think that the electric grid right now is in extremely fragile shape. And I think that the focus on investment in renewables is not going to be able to produce the base load that we need to keep the lights on or the heat going if we have a situation like that occur again.
Yeah, and that's, a great example of kind of a one-off thing that could happen, say next February there's a big storm across the United States, and we have that issue if we invest solely into solar panels and wind, and we try to quote unquote transition. I think another good example is look at Europe. Look at how hard and how fast they set up solar and wind and renewable and tried to get away from fossil fuels, and look at the situation they're in now. Their energy cost is astronomical, and they have really no out. They're several years away from getting a LNG import terminal, and they're letting a dictator kind of control their pricing, and that could happen too. So a combination of solar and wind and energy, it's needed. And if you want to say for reducing carbon emissions or however you want to pitch it, but I think the need for fossil fuels as an energy source to help once again maintain the lifestyle we have, it's got to be there.
And again, I am not disagreeing with you in any way, shape, form, or fashion. I do understand where you're coming from. We do. I did just post a report that what was it? Not too long ago. Well, actually, wind is the number two producer of electricity in the United States. Is number two behind natural gas at this point. And I do understand in Texas's situation of being uniquely isolated from the rest of the power grid. Well, the majority of Texas. There are a few areas that are part of the regular grid in the United States. Um, we've had very severe winter in northern states, and we didn't have the cascading failures that they had in Texas. Now, I'm sure that there are more details that you and I may not know specifically, and I understand where that problem comes from. Um, every time something goes bad, we can't keep looking for someone to blame. We have to look for something to fix. And that needs to be our mindset. Let's stop passing the buck. Let's
Right.
stop blaming. This is where a campaign like mine comes in. I am an individual who I don't want to spend my time having fights on TV, talking about it's their fault, it's that guy's fault, it's that guy's fault. No, the purpose of a legislator is to go to Washington and
Right.
solve problems, and in some cases, prevent problems from becoming or minimize the effect of problems that you foresee. Um, we can't afford legislators who want to go to Washington just to preserve their seat. Gerrymandering has created our situation. Let's call a spade a spade. Gerrymandering has created this because there's no incentive for a lot of politicians to make any compromises right now. None. Because many of them are in safe seats. My opponent is one of them. He's in a seat that's considered safe, uh, but we beg to differ. And because of this, many of our politicians no longer campaign. Many of them no longer go and see their constituents. They don't hold town halls anymore unless it's a controlled environment, a controlled event, because they won't do anything. And then here's the other part. This is the real cynical part. Most of them will sit in Washington and do nothing and wait for the next election cycle in the hopes that their team gains more seats. And then the political brinksmanship begins all over again.
Yeah. And
And
I've,
so this is where our stalemates are happening. I want to be a problem solver. The comment, the well, David has a couple of comments, and I read both, and I'm going to respond to both of them. And I agree with David. Our engineers and technical professionals do need to be afforded the opportunity to do their job. Period. I agree with that 100%. The second part is, and I have an op-ed I've been shopping around talking about the effect of term limits. Do we want term limits? And I can tell you that term limits will only exacerbate our current situation. And here's why. So basically, it gives somebody in small town Nebraska, very small town Nebraska, it gives them the power to tell somebody in New York that they've served long enough their constituency. And in reality, the people in that constituency feel that their representative is serving them well because their representative comes and sees them, talks to them, and things of that nature, keeps them abreast of what's going on. And so you're giving the power to somebody in small town America to tell somebody they've been in there long enough, which gives, again, it surrenders more power to less populated areas. Again, a problem in the United States. Also, once you start issuing term limits, people no longer vote for the candidate, they vote for the party. And so that makes things even worse, particularly when you add gerrymandering to the mix. We have a perfect mess that we, the people of the United States, have created. The term limit, on this, I agree 100% with Chuck Grassley. The term limit is the next election. If people truly wanted term limits, you would not see a 90% incumbency rate in the United States House of Representatives, in the United States Senate and House. 90% of those people running will be returned to office next year. And for no other reason than I'm pissed off at Congress, but not my guy.
right.
And so
Well, I also
if
don't think that Congress, I don't think that anyone would say they really like Congress. Nobody
I'm
knows who to be mad at, and
uh,
it's very
uh,
difficult to figure out
mhm,
who is actually responsible for anything. Um,
exactly.
the
And again,
messaging nowadays is so convoluted. It is literally just people getting their one soundbite to
yep,
put on their campaign ads, which actually has nothing to do with what they may have been discussing in a hearing or anything like that. And speaking to that point, have you watched any of the interviews that were done? The Was it 2 weeks ago, April 6th, with the oil and gas industry executives in the congressional hearings? Have you watched any of those interviews yet?
honestly, I have not. I don't watch a lot of those interviews that are televised because a lot of it is just grandstanding. And I
So
don't,
I,
and
I
and
think it would be very opening for you to take a look at least some of the recaps
mhm,
from that hearing, because your party had quite a lot to say and continually shouted over and told the oil and gas industry executives to stop speaking so that they could get their sound bites. They had
yep,
no interest in hearing from these professionals who are operating multi-billion-dollar companies that are global companies. Uh, they had no interest in hearing what those executives had to say. They literally just wanted to be able to sit there and yell at them for their 5 minutes or whatever the time limit was, and it was grandstanding on an epic scale that
Yep.
was a extreme waste of taxpayer money.
Yep.
And I don't think it helped anyone get answers about any of the problems that our country or the world are facing right now. It was just one of those situations that you kind of sat there and wonder, what's the point of even having these people sitting here right now? Because if you just wanted to yell at someone, you can yell at the camera all day long.
And I think that's where, going back to the education of the general public and as an industry, we have to do a better job. Is those people are fishing for a soundbite. They're grandstanding. We all agree on that. They're looking because there's no term limits, and I agree with your point. Is every election is the term limit. If they were, unsatisfied with their representative, they would vote him out. But if that
Mhm.
representative chooses not to educate or has a group of people that vote for him who they know think a certain way, then that's what they're going to do. They're not going to go solve problems. They're not going to go listen to oil and gas execs, tell them here's the real issues. They're going to go up there, get their soundbite. That's their campaign slogan, and people will vote for them. And us as an industry, and I'm not trying to beat us up because I'm part of it. I'm just saying we need to do a better job of saying, here's what oil and gas provides you people, and here's why people like that in office and are making these decisions are not necessarily good for your, when you go to the gas pump. You think they're fighting for you. You think they're there to lower gas prices. They're there to stay there. That's all they're there. They're there to save their seat. They're not there to fix your problem. And we as oil and gas guys, we don't like, it's kind of hard to say this, but we don't like $100 oil, to be honest, because there's a demand destruction. There's people that drive less. There's less use of it. So it
Well,
actually will drive the price
and
down.
and with inflation adjustment, $100 oil is not actually $100
Right.
oil
I
right
mean,
now.
yeah, that's
So
true. I mean, you have a lot of moving parts that make it go over $100 and make gas what it is. Everything across the board is up due to
Mhm.
inflation and printing money. And again, it seems like it's politicians trying to save their seat and not actually fix problems. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation, or why, we invited you on the show. We wanted to kind of
Mhm.
educate you the best we could and kind of see where you stood, but just helping your constituents understand the need for oil and gas, and not to just immediately go bash us and say, oh, they're polluting or they're making all this money. I think that doesn't need to be the conversation. The conversation needs to be, hey, we need these guys. We need this industry. What can we do to help them produce more, secure more, safer energy for our country? And yeah, if there's a rail system that works, if there's, a bus system that works that will help lower it, help these people get to work without paying crazy gas prices, I'm all for that. And I think most people are. It's just the rhetoric of yelling at oil and gas companies for making a bunch of money when oil goes up. But when you look at it, it's mostly their fault for the way they demonize us and the way they say our industry is so bad for everything across. I mean, they've chosen everything in the book to say that we're terrible people. And we've provided a lifestyle for people that's not seen anywhere else. So that's where we want to have the conversation. We want you to understand is, if you get into Congress, it's not about grandstanding. It's about problem solving. And it starts with having a conversation with the other side of the aisle, or something like this with a group of technical people, that here's the real issue and here's how we think we can solve it. And, anyways, I'm just kind of blabbling on, but I think
Yeah.
that's what we want to do.
So, what are some general solutions that you would suggest at this point? I mean, we're actually, the United States is a net energy producer, so we do have that on our side. Um, and
So
so,
there hasn't been a refinery built in the United States since the mid 70s.
yeah,
And
on
that's
that,
an environmental issue
hmm
that has been toted. Okay, so the refineries, we have a guy in our group who works at a refinery, has a lot of good insight, and he's telling us that they're running max capacity. They're running as hard as they can, and there needs to be more infrastructure. And when you look at the new Green Deal, or you look at this Build Back Better plan, all that stuff doesn't address that issue. That if you want to lower gas prices, you need to build refineries. You need to be able to process this stuff. Even if you're not a net producer of oil and gas and you have to import some, you can't refine it into gasoline that drives the price down. You can't do it without that. So we got to get off the climate change high horse. We got to get off of all that and say we need refinery infrastructure. The second thing you can do is stop the rhetoric on the political side of the pipelines are bad, Keystone Pipeline's bad. That would bring so much more supply in the United States from Canada if we had the pipeline. Those are the kind of things that can be done quickly, and it changes the whole mindset of people from New York and LA that actually invest in a lot of this stuff. Is, hey, the government's behind these guys. That's where the money's going to flow. They will flow money to us. And I guarantee you the oil industry is probably the dumbest industry when it comes to drilling wells and doing things. We will drill the shit out of wells. We will literally drill ourselves into negative oil. I mean, we will do it, and we've always done it. They will competitively drill themselves out of business. And that's the environment as a congressman or as a legislator you need to create, is get the money flowing in, let us do what we've always done, and the prices will go down.
And so let me ask a question, because the refinery situation did come up in my research previously, and I do understand that there have been no new permits for refineries since the only thing that's been done is they've added on to existing refineries,
Correct.
and
Right.
that's all that's happened since the 70s. So explain to me what is preventing the building of new refineries, just out of curiosity.
I would have to research exactly why they can't get a permit. If I had to shoot in the dark, it's regulatory based on climate change or
Mm,
environmental issues. You build a refinery, it's a big environmental problem. You could have groundwater contamination, it
hmm
pollutes the
We
air,
we
you know.
actually we just had our refinery expert hop on the call. Let's see if we
Oh,
can get him on
There it
here.
is.
Hey, 90s, are you
excellent.
there?
Coming in hot. What do we got?
There we go.
Oh
So
my
man,
goodness.
we were just asking about do you have any insight as to why we have not built any new refineries in the last 30, 40 years?
I do have some insight. Some of that is permitting. There's a little of that NIMBY going on. Not in my backyard. The second part is that we've expanded refineries because it's easier to get new permits or expand permits than it is to get a new permit.
Yeah.
And then number three, it's just not a really big money making opportunity. We've had to shut refineries down more than we've wanted to build new ones. The new ones that have been built have been in the Middle East or India, right, where they actually need the barrels. And the barrels for America, we've gotten so good at trading or shipping, as far as docks wise, that we just haven't had to do that. And the slates have kind of changed up to where, the natural gas has taken a lot of the chemical feed and left us with a lot of naphtha. So that leads to more, diesel, gasoline, and other products. And so as that natural gas price goes up, though, we may find ourselves in a deficit or having to pay more, which will lead to that flip in that spreadsheet that a lot of these guys use. That'll hopefully make it inhibited. What's the word? It would
Cost
make it
prohibitive. Cost
cost
prohibitive.
prohibitive to start finally expanding and or building new ones.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. The refinery question is always a good one for me, because because I do understand that any disruption in our refinery system, shutdowns here in the United States because of hurricanes and so on and so forth, those things affect our gas. And I've always asked the question, why have we not built some refineries further inland that would be safer? I'm sure that at this point we do have technology available that we're able to plan a refinery to where the an incident would be minimized if there were
It's
one.
and the technology's been there forever. It's a pipeline. So all you need is a pipeline to transfer goods to the refinery in order
Hmm.
for them to refine. And pipelines being a hot topic with permitting and environmental issues, it kind of circles back to that. Is if we built one, say in Kansas City might be happy. We might get lower prices in the Midwest and everything's good. There's some here in Tulsa. They just have a pipeline system that brings a large amount of crude to Cushing and so therefore it's able to be refined. So it's not maybe a sense of where's the technology to get a more inland refinery. It's back on policies and permitting to get the pipelines laid to one that's more inland to get the raw material they need to refine.
And let me add something right there. It's not just that. The reason most refineries are on the coast is water. We use a tremendous amount of, whether it be cooling water, boiler feed water. Water is so important to any chemical and or refinery. Big time for refineries. So being able to have that opportunity for plentiful amounts of water is big. The other thing is that the Gulf Coast allows for the ability for water, train, truck, and road. And when you have multiple outlets for your products and or to bring in raw feed, that right there is what you want: consistency, stability, and opportunity. And that's why I think a lot of the bigger refineries and the expansions have all occurred on the Gulf Coast and not up north. If anything, we've seen the refineries shut down in the interior of the United States.
Okay. All right. All right. So, and and as always with any oil and gas discussion, the Keystone Pipeline always comes up, the XL extension. It is my understanding, and you can correct me where I may be wrong, that the particular type of crude that would be transported by this pipeline is the most corrosive type, with the tar sands, if you will. That's my understanding. Um, and because that particular they do have excessive number of leaks in pipelines that carry that type of crude, and the the way that the path of that particular pipeline would go over several uh, groundwater areas and could risk contamination of those groundwater areas, which was one of the main reason for the opposition of the Keystone XL extension. Um, so with that type of oil being transported over such a vast area with the high probability of leaks along the pipeline that may not be discovered quickly, I do know that the technology does discover them quickly, and it will actually shut down pipelines for the most part. Um, is that particular XL portion worth the risk to drinking water in so many areas?
Yes and no from the refinery guru.
Okay.
So yes, it would be beneficial to have a second route of that material that is coming down the regular Keystone pipeline at this time. But
Mhm.
I do understand it's become a very religious moment for the left, and accepting that says it's not worth the damage politically, and that's the reason they're not using political capital to finish it. But unless we're going to build more refineries, the majority of that material is already being refined. I don't think we need more, and I think that once you build the refinery or the reason to have it, not just to export it, right? I think that you could then make the argument that it's appropriate, but just putting pipelines in place because maybe we'll need it isn't helpful, and that doesn't
Okay.
help the narrative for Americans.
That's an excellent answer, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Without the capacity to refine, adding that pipeline is moot. Thank you very much.
Yep. And I think, if we want to point out a bad player in this deal, being a little bit of an industry insider, there's some stuff behind the scenes that's going into that. And part of it has to do with an individual who bought some rail systems in that area that moves the crude around by his rails. And so getting a pipeline in there makes his investment not worth as much. So, there's those kind of things that go into it too. But again, we want to point
Conspiracy
out,
or not, he's correct too.
we want to point
I
out
got I
bad
got you. I got you.
yeah,
I understand exactly where you go with that. I
right,
understand. I understand.
right,
It's not a yeah, it does hurt that investment over a long term.
yeah,
That's a pretty smooth way to say that.
right. And again, it just goes back to, if we want to solve the real problem, here's the real issues. How do we get that out to the general public that these are the real issues,
Hmm.
and not how do I get elected by telling my constituents I'm
Hmm.
going to go in there and shut down big oil, or I'm going to go in there and change, our climate, and I'm going to make your environment safer because we won't have oil. In reality, that's really not the conversation that needs to be happening. And that's just where I want to get to with this conversation, is how do we educate the general public to understand their need for energy, their need for fossil fuels, and how do we change the political environment that allows this capital to inflow so we can lower prices, because I guarantee you we will.
Well, and I taking all this in, the biggest takeaway that I have at this point right now, that you all have made clear to me, is that one of the things that we need to drive down gas prices is not necessarily new wells, but new refineries.
Yeah,
Would,
refineries will
would
help.
that would that be a correct piece to say?
It's correct. It's
Hmm.
a overall view. You still need new wells. A lot of
Hmm.
the production that's being drilled now, conventional production, say from the early teens to late 70s, was big wells that were vertical wells, and they gave up a lot of oil over a long period of time. I
Okay.
mean, hundreds of barrels for years. The newer
Hmm.
wells, if you look at the decline curves, they might come on at 1,000 barrels a day, but within a year they're at 100. So if you
Okay.
don't have active investment in new wells
Hmm.
and that dies out, you lose very quickly your energy plus. We're making our own oil here. That goes away very fast.
Hmm.
So you have
So
to have investment in that
Okay.
and the refineries to drive the gas price down.
Okay.
there's also the added issue of pipeline permitting for domestic production. So we have the Keystone XL. We've already kind of covered a little bit of that, but the permitting process for pipeline projects, just moving from West Texas, from the Permian Basin to the Gulf Coast, has been an issue. And these permitting projects take years to get done because of the changing federal requirements for these projects. So the Biden administration has just now, their EPA has just now said that they will start a mandatory environmental evaluation process that has a required time period, um, where they will not make a decision in a certain time period. And these processes were already slow and arduous for companies, because when you have a 6 to 10 year lead time on investment of capital before you can see any significant return on that capital, a lot of these companies, you cannot forecast that far out for energy demand. And so if you are bringing a new pipeline project online and you've been working on it for 6 to 10 years, and let's say you're in a, a boom period where everybody is producing more. So we have increased production, prices start to go down. This is the boom and bust cycle that happens every 5 to 10 years in the oil industry. If you bring that pipeline on at the wrong part of that cycle, your project is probably going to generate negative returns for quite a few years. And
Okay.
that's not good for investors. So a lot of these pipeline projects from the Permian down to the Gulf Coast, because they got so delayed with not just federal permitting, but the overall uh, idea from activists that if they can stop pipelines, they will stop fossil fuels. Well,
No.
That's fine, but again, you're going to continue driving the price up. And that's not something that you see immediately in the price. That's something that you're going to start feeling years later down the road. And most people are not going to be looking at these failed pipeline projects and saying, okay, well, maybe this contributed. Nobody remembers that except for the people that were involved in trying to get that pipeline approved. So it's not just pipelines from Canada with the Keystone
Mm,
XL or any of that
mhm.
stuff. There is a issue, and this is in the state of Texas I'm talking about. So Texas is very receptive to working with the oil and gas industry, and we've had 3 major pipelines from West Texas over the past 5 years that have not been built as a result of the permitting and the general perception and backlash, um, even within our own state. And so all of these are, factors that are just contributing to a higher price at the pump, a larger um, gap between supply and demand that we're experiencing
And,
right now.
Okay.
and let me add something real quick because I got to run. But what he just said is very true because we need natural gas ports right now. And there are ports, whether it be with Buffett or some of the other ones that are out there, that have either been canceled or delayed so long that they're not even breaking ground now in the state of Texas. So, we need those BCFs of nat gas to send to Europe, and those places that were planned or were going to be built have just totally been canceled and or shelved. And so he is 100% correct. We can see that in the permits.
And I think too, when you talk about investors in this stuff and how it doesn't generate a return for them, most people think, well, screw them, they're rich people. But a lot of this investment comes from teacher pension funds, firefighter funds. There's a lot of money that people don't understand that come from everyday working people's retirement plans into these projects. And as an owner of the pipeline or an oil company or any publicly traded company, you have a fiduciary responsibility to have returns for these types of organizations. And so you have all that headwind where you're trying to permit the pipeline. They're telling you they won't look at it for so many days. It makes the project push out 10 years. Your price at the pump goes up, and your teacher retirement fund no longer has a viable investment. They have an L on that. And it's just a way to look at it, that it's not just a bunch of rich guys in New York. I mean, it's common everyday people's retirement plans are in some of this oil and gas investment.
So, without regulation, what is the possibility of, or what is the probability of bad actors taking advantage of that situation? That's
Without
the next question.
without regulation at all, yeah, it'll be mayhem. You have to have it.
Okay.
You
All right.
have to have it. You cannot have it as so cumbersome as it is now and so negative towards our industry now, because this is what you're going to get. These prices will stay this high for a long period of time because of the political environment, because of the regulatory red tape, and it's growing. And it doesn't even necessarily have to grow on paper where it's actually a hard pass deal. All they have to say is, this is what we want to pass. This is the members of Congress coming in that want to pass the same thing we do. And that's enough headwind to not get the investment. If they know there's enough people in power to pass these type of ideas, investments will stop almost immediately.
So where's the middle ground as far as regulatory burden and obligation and so on and so forth? Because there's got to be a point at which we can meet the needs of the industry and protect the public.
That's
And
the
that
trillion
that's the
dollar
main.
question.
Because I think the
Yeah.
other thing you have to look at is, think of how many wells we've drilled in the United States, how many pipelines are in the United States, how many houses have natural gas,
Mhm.
how many instances do you see large scale actually affect human life in the United States with the current policies that are in place? What incident can you come up with in your head that says this is a time when we should have had more regulations on them.
I cannot say that I've seen instances where more regulation would have necessarily stopped any one thing. Um, I can speculate on what might happen, and I want to see to it. And again, I'm I'm not a regular politician in any respects. I'm just a guy that's been a working stiff my whole life. I've army time and been teaching, so I don't. I'm not here to say that I'm in an absolute corner on anything, and that's what I think needs to be made clear. Um, there is some malleability as long as we can show with confidence that this is a good thing. This is I can get behind a lot of stuff, but there's got to be those backstops and the what ifs and the planning ahead. One of the things I've learned as a teacher, as an educator generally, is that the better planned you are ahead of time, the fewer incidents you're going to have on the backside.
And I'm not
So,
I'm not saying there's not an instance where there has been some problems. Most of the stuff we see nowadays, if you take out the BP oil spill, and again, that's a bad player in the industry. If you want my opinion, how they
well,
operate,
we've
and
seen that.
yes, and if you take some of the most recent stuff I can think of, there's some, blowouts in West Texas. There's some groundwater stuff, some stuff leaking. It's all generated from way back in the day when there wasn't regulations. So it's a good point to have regulations, but there's not an instance that I can think of that I can recall. If you look at statistics, being a math teacher, if you say the amount of natural gas and oil we move and refine every day, the amount of gallons of gasoline people buy, there's not been one major incidence where any of that stuff has negatively affected people, hurt people, killed a bunch of people. It's just not there. And so this whole idea that we need more regulations for an industry that's not safe and not doing right for the climate, I can't find an instance where we've had such a problem with it that we need more red tape. I see an instance where we have a supply issue and we have bad policies that are driving the price up. And that's the problem I see is your everyday working person, my in-laws being one of them, are teachers. Affording $4 gasoline is just not a viable thing. And then it drives up cost of their groceries and everything across the board. That is way worse than maybe the one or two instances anybody can come up with, even saying the BP oil spill, that I would say we need more regulation for, if that makes sense. I think less regulation, less political headwinds generates lower gasoline prices. And if you can point to an instance where more regulation has saved more people, I'd like to see it.
So, in lieu of the regulation for easement, would you be in favor of legislation that would um, have a severe penalty for bad actors?
Yeah, and I'm
I'm talking a substantial monetary penalty on the backside because I
Well,
don't think a lot of people are listening until you hit them where it hurts, where it's going to
I
sting.
I don't I don't know that that is something that I would be in favor of unless this was something that was more across the board, because there are bad actors in every industry,
Mhm,
and it seems like in a lot of those industries people just get a pass. And so there were a lot of bad actors that
mhm.
contributed to the 2008 financial crisis.
Yep.
They got a federal bailout, they got a free pass. um, I know that there were a handful of people that actually had some penalties levied on them, but
Mhm.
the vast majority of the financial industry that knew they
They walked
were
away. Yeah.
defrauding the American people and their
Yep.
investors,
And
they literally
and
walked away. And so I
mhm,
feel like there were far stiffer consequences with the Enron crisis in 2000.
Mhm.
And that was something where that was isolated to one company, but a lot of those people ended up in jail. And so I think that if you're going to levy a huge burden for bad actors in the energy industry, I don't think that it should be isolated to the energy industry. I think that should be something that's across the board for all industries in our country, because there are there are bad actors that do far worse to hurt actual American people in other industries. And so you can't look at that and say, well, there was groundwater pollution right there. That's why we're going to find these people $100 million. Well, what about, the payday loans people who are,
Predatory
aggressively
lending.
taking
Yeah.
advantage of people who are in need
Or
and
pharmaceuticals or any of those guys.
affecting far more people than a pipeline spill would, um, in a population density issue. So I don't know that I would be in favor of that, because again, this is just you're putting a heavier burden on an industry that is absolutely necessary for human life.
You are exactly where I am, and I'm not just talking about, because one of the big things that I hear all the time, one of the big refrains that I hear from a lot of Republicans is less regulation, less regulation, less regulation. And you know what? I'm to the point where perhaps it's easier to get a company to be self-regulatory a lot more. You do keep some regulation in place, because if you don't have a minimum standard, you got nothing. And I do know that here in Missouri, that a lot of things that don't happen in Missouri because of regulations are not because of federal regulations. It's because of state and local regulations. Because, and again, I'm a true believer in the best governance as far as local issues is your local government. So if environmentally, if Kansas City, Missouri doesn't see something as viable in their city limits, then Kansas City, Missouri should have that right to turn somebody away. But if Brookfield, Missouri says, "Oh, well, we could do that with these things in place," Brookfield should be allowed to do what they need to do, because they're making that final decision and their voters are making those decisions on their own, instead of just let's deregulate and have fun. So yes, I do believe that consistency across the board, and that's one thing that we haven't done since 2008. We have not put in place a framework to penalize bad actors in any industry. And so if there's a framework in public policy that does allow us to do that, and it's enforceable by law, I think it's I think it's worth looking down the road at it, and giving that opportunity to oil and gas, the financial industry, and so on and so forth, to do a little bit more self-regulation.
So
And
I think that you're bringing up kind of an interesting uh, topic here on states' rights, local governance rights versus the federal regulation. And I think that in terms of the federal regulation, they are they being our people in Congress up in Washington are too often trying to fit a square peg hole, and they are looking at isolated instances of abuse or misuse, fraud, whatever it happens to be, and thinking we need to pass federal regulations to govern this, where those federal regulations might not necessarily, as you were just mentioning, be to the advantage of certain uh, local governments or state governments. And you are tying people's hands to be more reliant on the federal government for protection in a regulatory standpoint. I think that there are a lot of federal regulations that could be better handled by state governments. That does not mean that state governments are always going to make the best decisions. And there are plenty of states that have made some terrible decisions and have caused huge deficits for their populations over the last decades. So it's an issue that I think there needs to be some balance, and I think that it needs to be more of a open conversation, which again at the beginning of this talk we kind of covered how the politics in Washington are very driven by getting that soundbite, keeping your seat, and not kind of, I guess, rocking the boat, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as we talked earlier, um, I think the federal government needs to set a minimum standard across the board. There has to be a minimum standard of this is the bare minimum of what you have to do, and the state and local government comes in and closes whatever gap that they think they need. Um, we need to prevent the abuses of specific communities. We need to prevent the abuses of specific areas, and so on and so forth. These things have been done over the years in the United States, and we have hurt entire communities based on public policy because we thought it was okay to put something right next door to a low income community because, well, they don't write big campaign checks. So, yes, I do. Like I said, I'm open to discussing a framework for how we better have companies hold themselves accountable. Because if there's an accountability in it and a dollar amount being you're going to find not just the company, but you're going to find the CEO, everybody down the line for that responsibility, taking care of that. I think that is more applicable because then you could have recouped the money faster from 2008. Then you probably could have prevented 2008 from happening. You could have prevented a lot of things. These are not regulations but accountability standards that says, hey, this is the bare minimum what you have to meet, but if you end up messing up and it causes damage among this group or in this scenario, then your fine is going to be levied. That's going to be sizable, and it may put you out of business. Because the reality is, I want businesses to stay in business. There's nothing better than to see a business thrive. Oil
Yeah,
and
I think
gas is.
you could have areas where if it's next to a certain population, you want to lay a line or build a refinery. These are, like you said, a minimum requirements. And if you
Mhm.
mess up, this is what you're going to have to pay. And that'll help either drive in responsible people that say, yeah, I want to build it there and I'll do the right thing, or no, I don't, because I don't want that responsibility. So I'm going to go elsewhere and build it. And that's a reasonable way of doing it. Is if this is a sensitive environment, if this is XYZ, and that's up to the company to make the decision whether they want to take on that risk or not with,
Mhm.
say, fines or whatever legal repercussion could happen. But I think, yeah, thanks. Sorry, my wife's in here and she likes to correct me. Anyways, yeah, everybody knows how that goes. But we have to have a better tone towards oil and gas, and I'm just
Hmm.
going to keep hammering this point home because in order for your constituents in your neighborhood to have a lower gas price, it's not to fight the oil companies. It's not to write them a check and help them out. It's to cut some red tape and to stop the rhetoric that we're bad and that we're not needed and we're hurting the environment. That's the stuff that's got to change. And so we just got to have these conversations that, hey, look, guys, yes, there's bad apples in that industry, but wherever they work, they probably worked for some company that wasn't good or some
Hmm.
CEO that wasn't good, and they get out or whatever, and we just got to do the same thing here.
No. In the short term, we do definitely need to understand that our transition to alternative energies is not going to happen overnight, and because that's not going to happen overnight, we have to work with what we have on the ground. And there may be a case where we're never going to be able to get away from fossil fuels unless we can master tabletop fusion, cold fusion.
Right.
So the reality is we have to deal with what's in our face and what's real. We can have our pie in the sky expectations and hopes, but we have to deal with what's on the ground right now. So yes, in a lot of ways, I agree with you. We do need to see what we can do to help drive down the price of gas through public policy, and if that means exploring refinery expansion, and like I said, if we do things that force companies to be accountable to themselves for fear of a real fine, of a significant fine or penalty, I think that's going to help. And basically, writing policy that's ironclad that can't be circumvented by running to the court. Um, the One of the larger challenges that we have is the fact that a lot of these large corporations have teams of lawyers and they find ways around regulatory, regulations, penalties, and things of that nature. And it's just one of those deals. We've got to find a way to well, basically exist together, because we can't look at one group and say, oh well, no, you're not worthy because we don't think that you're beneficial. Like I said, I'm a realist. I do paint a real picture. I don't believe in sitting here saying that we can absolutely do this overnight. Is it all
So
of this is going to take time?
I'd like to take the opportunity to segue just a little bit
Hmm.
into another topic that we often discuss here on our show, which is we'd be very interested to know what your stance is on Bitcoin mining or cryptocurrencies or any of that, because that is something that's been in the news, uh, in the headlines for the last year or so, and
Yeah.
it's been something that the oil and gas industry has been focused on very heavily for the past couple of months. So
Yeah.
I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Bitcoin and crypto is very complicated for the average Joe, myself included. Um, I, you know, there are people that can talk to you about blockchains forever. I'm not one of those people. I'm just going to shoot you straight. Now, I don't know. They believe that the benefits of crypto is that you're going to eliminate um, the inherent bias that's in our current monetary system. Um, I don't know. So
So
I I don't have a
what
specific position on that.
I'm not asking for, technical aspects or
Mhm.
anything, but just more in a general regulatory environment. If you are elected to Congress and are sitting in on some of these debates, I'm just curious because it seems like a lot of the people in Washington take a very narrow mindset when they're looking at specifically issues with Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. And you can almost trace back some of their sound bites to specific news sources, articles.
Mhm.
And I think that's an issue where we have the median age of Congress is higher than the median age of our population, which goes
Not a
back
problem.
to people protecting their seat and everything, which we've talked about. But
Gerrymandering. Hmm.
going to the issue with Bitcoin and everything, this is not something that I think I'm 36 years old, about to be 37. I think I'd have to ask my wife. She knows. I quit counting after 30. So I've I've had friends who have been involved with Bitcoin mining since somewhere around 2012. And talking with them about all of this stuff, I thought this was, fake internet money. And we gave a lot of grief to one of my friends who's been here on the show with us quite a few times,
Hmm.
and still give him a lot of grief for being so nerdy about all of this stuff. You have to understand extreme technical aspects of not just how the hash algorithm works and all of that, but like game theory and other aspects that are not technical in nature. They're more philosophical, abstract.
Hmm.
And I think that a lot of that is something that Congress does not factor in. They read one article that says, people are using Bitcoin to buy drugs, and then that's their soundbite, is that everybody that uses Bitcoin is a criminal.
Yep.
Or they read something about how it could be from a news source that is pro Bitcoin, that is saying Bitcoin will be, the new store of value, and countries will switch over to Bitcoin standards, and the global economy will be based on Bitcoin in the next, 10, 20 years. They read that and they think, well, that's a threat to the United States economy. So I think that there's a interesting inflection point that we're at right now, where China banned Bitcoin mining, what, I think 6 months ago, maybe, intern,
Hmm.
is that right? 6 months ago ish. And so we've had a huge influx of Bitcoin mining companies in the United States. And that is a result of our energy policy. We have a lot of available, cheap energy that's reliable as well. And this plays into renewables, this plays into fossil fuels, this plays into nuclear to an extent. So the the issue of Congress debating how to regulate or um, supervise or incentivize or take advantage of this new growing industry in the United States absolutely affects energy policy directly, because there are a lot of oil and gas producers now that are using Bitcoin
Bitcoin.
miners in lieu of flaring natural gas and things like that. And I know that Scott has some firsthand experience doing that. They have a couple of Bitcoin mines right now. It's something that I think uh, Congress takes a 1 second look at, and they decide, okay, well, this is my stance. And I think it's a much more complicated issue, which you just said yourself, that people don't
Hmm.
understand
That's right.
how involved all of these different processes are.
Yep. And I've sat in a room, I've sat in chat groups with people that start explaining it, and I can tell you this is one of those things, either you get it or you don't. And if you don't get it and you want to know more, I kind of look at it in terms of my classroom. Um, there's a cutoff point at which I have to stop direct instruction because you lose students. And I don't care who the teacher is, same thing across the board. Every teacher knows they have a cutoff point where they have to stop instructing and try and get with their kids and find out what the kids know. And Bitcoin is one of those things right now, because it's like you're giving us this tool that is now going to be used instead of the currency that we're used to for transactions such as this, and this. And so then the Bitcoin exchange rate, blah, blah, blah. Now you're getting, it's like I'm living in Germany all over again. And follow, I had to know how many marks I could get for $1. So, and this is a challenge for a lot of people. So Americans we have not had to deal with having to exchange our currency for something else. So Bitcoin may be here to stay, and it's something that we're going to need to learn a little bit more about. I don't believe that everybody that's involved in Bitcoin is a criminal. Um, uh, Unfortunately, the association that the association people are drawing is based a lot on um, their experience. So how are we exposed to Bitcoin? It's like we were exposed to nuclear power by two bombs being dropped. So we are afraid of nuclear power as a result. And so we're exposed to Bitcoin by criminals holding people for ransom, holding networks for ransom, and they'll only take Bitcoin in payment, and so on and so on and so on. So yes, it is a big deal that's how people perceive it. And it's going to take some time, and Bitcoin itself is going to have to do a better education of people on, you know,
Yeah,
what it
and
means.
that's what I think, again, back on the same point. It's an education. It's a
Hmm.
lack of education.
Yep.
Bitcoin's front, oil and gas, everybody. It's a really large gap of educating people on how things work, and I
Hmm.
think politicians really play into that and get it voted on it because of the sound bites and the grandstanding. They understand it. They know more than they say they know, but they also understand how to get elected, especially these longtime congressmen. They get that these sound bites and this telling the public what they want to hear. And now with social media, it's just like you threw gasoline on the fire and it
Hmm.
blows up, and it's really easy to sway people to think a certain way with a few tweets. And so I think that's the real issue is a lack of education and people investing in their own education to understand these type of things.
Well, a
So,
lot.
Scott, could you enlighten us real quick on what it is that y'all are actually doing with Bitcoin and natural gas right now? Because I think that might be more of a direct example of what's going on out here in the
Yeah,
field.
so we have two Bitcoin mines. One is attached to a pipeline system that feeds uh, a market. So the gas can be used in your home, or we can burn it in our generators. And we do a little bit of both. We don't consume all the gas there. So some people in Tulsa burn this gas in their house, and then we mine Bitcoin with a small portion of that. And we sell the Bitcoin, generates more revenue for our investors. We also have another mine that's probably more interesting is we have a field that the pipeline shut off on us because of the low flow, and they basically can't maintain the pipeline because of the input or the throughput is so low. So these are wells that are stranded, open well bores, plugging liability to us. We set a mine on that, and it basically took a plugging liability, a zero or a negative for us, and turned it into a positive generator. And it also helps the royalty owners. In this case, it's Native Americans here in Oklahoma. They will get a check now where they weren't getting a check from it, and our company will also get a check for mining the Bitcoin. That's kind of the two mines we have.
Okay.
Which I think is taking an issue with the oil and gas industry, flaring, which has
Yep.
been about 2.5 years ago, became a huge issue. And the Texas Railroad Commission started having to crack down on it because there were a lot of publications talking about issues with flaring and so on and so forth. But I think that's a positive solution to a problem, because otherwise, if you guys have to plug and abandon those wells, that oil and gas is probably not going to be recoverable at any point in the near future, because it's not going to be economical to reopen those wells
That's
without
right.
significant investment in more infrastructure. So I think this is an interesting solution to a problem of not being able to get pipelines, but it's also only applicable in some very specific instances.
Yep. Yeah, it takes marginal fields or fields that maybe don't have a market for their gas, and it helps them become more profitable and extends the life of that field. This particular field I'm speaking to is it has 2 or 3 barrels of oil a day that it also produces that we can't without either flaring, which they won't give us a permit, or venting the gas, which is worse. So there's a locked amount of oil behind some of this stuff. So using Bitcoin to reactivate some of these older wells, again, helps pay the royalty owner, helps pay the company, but it also might mitigate some environmental issues that you have where you have just rotting wells that are sitting there, and this can reactivate them, start using them again, working them over, all those kind of things.
Okay.
So I wanted to illustrate that that's kind of a point where, I know asking you about Bitcoin and everything seemed a little bit off topic, but that's kind of how it relates back to the oil and gas industry, where we're trying to be creative with our solutions to problems of economics, which, building pipelines on older fields and things like that, you would have to build new pipelines that are actually smaller pipelines than what was in place, because what Scott was just talking about with the throughput from those wells where they put that Bitcoin mine, those wells aren't producing enough gas for it to be worthwhile with the existing pipeline. And if you built a smaller pipeline system, you may be able to move that gas and have somebody that would take that gas to market. However, your expense of building that pipeline is probably greater than your
The return
profit
on the well.
margin.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so your other option would be you have to plug and abandon those wells. And then that is, shutting off a potential source of, revenue, profit for not just the company operating those wells, but the people who own the oil and gas royalties
Mm-hmm.
on those wells also. And the
And this
likelihood
is
that someone would come back and reopen those wells in the future is probably very slim.
zero. Yeah, and
Yeah.
again, Bitcoin is a way to make money off of this and revitalize older fields and all that. But there's other solutions too. I mean, we've been approached by some people who want to maybe run this gas to their house or run a business off of it. Or my in-laws family, they have a well on their property that was kind of an exploratory well, and the company was looking for oil and they found gas, and they just said, here, take the well. And they've been running 5 or 6 houses and a practice basketball gym off of this house or off of this well. And so that's another conversation where, hey, look, we've got this field in this area. All these houses are using propane. Let's come up with a solution where you guys can use this gas. It makes it profitable for us to be able to operate it. And then you guys can get off of propane and use gas for it. And most oil and gas companies that I know are open to any kind of market that won't shut them in. They obviously want to make money, but it also helps maybe the community around them. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had where let's go plug out all these wells and fix this environmental issue. Well, let's find a solution for the wells that are there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, to make this clear, I do want you to understand. I want to see to it that no matter what happens, we have a smooth transition wherever we're going as we get to this blended environment where we're using oil and gas, wind and solar, natural gas, nuclear. As we move into that environment where we're trying to get our energy security under control, we've got to do the things it's going to take for us to um, um, make these things not only profitable but viable for the communities that they're serving. So I am not opposed to anything that again, if it's good for the state of Missouri, good for the sixth congressional district, good for the United States of America. We can have a real conversation about it. But and I'm not here to argue and fuss and fight. It's
Right.
not about that. We don't have enough people who want to govern. We have people in Washington that are looking for their soundbite, or they're just going to lay low and they're not even looking for a soundbite. They just want to keep their seat. And that is actually that my opponent actually applies in that area. He just wants to keep his seat. He doesn't chase a whole lot of sound bites, although he shows up when he has to. Uh,
And those are the
but
people that have to go.
yeah,
That's the type of people that need to be out of there. We need problem solvers. We need
yeah.
people that will shake the trees one way or the other. I mean,
So
that's
it's time to shake this thing up, and it's time to make things happen.
yeah.
Because we can't continue with the status quo. The status quo is not good enough anymore. We have to move into an era of accountability. Instead of sitting here passing the buck, saying it's his fault, it's their fault, it's that fault. No. All right. What have we done? What have we done to solve the problem? What have we done that's been proactive? What have we done that's been visionary, that looks at this problem 10 years from now? What have we done? If we've done nothing, then why are we still in office? Why are we still sending that person to office? There's
Well,
there's your there's your questions.
Mr. Martin, we certainly appreciate you coming on and having a discussion with us. And we do very much appreciate your openness to talking about different topics
Hmm.
and willing to learn from people on the other side and discuss things about the oil and gas industry, the energy
Hmm.
industry, politics in general. And we're going to kind of wrap things up here, but we want to say, a huge thank you for your service. Thank you for being open minded to discussing some of these topics with us. We've certainly learned a lot from you about your platform and your willingness to discuss topics that even we might not fully understand, and appreciate that. So,
you show me the person that understands everything and how it works. I'll show you a person that's lying to you, because because we are all excellent at the things that we spend time learning. We're all excellent at those things. There, consultant people like you is what I do, because I don't have the answers in oil and gas, and it's people like you that do. And so we need to have these discussions, and we need to be realistic about our expectations. And as I said, there's absolutely no reason to sit here and say there's an absolute solution on side A or side B.
yes,
Because if
sir.
we believe that there's an absolute solution, then we are ignoring the possibility of other completely and totally viable solutions, or a combination of solutions that can solve the biggest part of our problem. I want to say, I was scheduled to be on a couple weeks ago. I We did have a family emergency that we did have to attend to, and so I'm glad you guys accepted our asking to come back on again, because I I think people need to understand that this is I am not um, some partisan hack. I am an outsider of the political system who wants to work to solve America's problems. Because I'm not going to solve all those problems. We got a lot of issues, but we've got to look at them realistically and stop looking at them from an ideological standpoint, because because all we're doing when we're pushing the buttons, the ideological buttons, all we're doing is we're agitating, and when people are voting with their emotion and they're not voting with their brain.
That's
I
it.
want people here. I want
Yeah.
people here. The last time I made an emotional decision, um, I'm still dealing with some of the fallout from those emotional decisions. I think we all can say that 95% of the time our emotional decision, emotional choice was the wrong choice. And but when we sit down and we think about it and we're measured and we're calm and we think about it, I think we find that we make better decisions. And not only do we make better decisions, but the decisions that we make, we don't have to do as much fixing,
Yep.
because because we thought about what we're doing. Um, I encourage any of your listeners, any of your viewers, to stop by my website at henrymartinforcongress.com. I am not running a campaign filled with sound bites. I want to talk about real issues that are out there. We have real issues. As I said, healthcare, real issue for America. And when I talk about rural America, you're seeing rural hospitals closing at record rates because there's a lack of revenue in those areas. And so a farm accident can become catastrophic in minutes. And if you're getting rid of rural hospitals, it makes it even worse. And hell's bells, you guys in the oil industry, an accident on a rig can become catastrophic in minutes if you're closing down these rural hospitals where a lot of your rigs lie and things of that nature. And we have to be realistic. There's things that we can do. Is Like I said, our justice across the board. We've got to rethink what we're doing. We need uh, we need environmental justice. That's legit. Farmers, best environmentalists on the planet, in my opinion. In my opinion, they're the people that they rely on the ground to make their work. We need social justice. Social justice is an issue. Uh, there are things that we do now as a country that we need to stop doing. There are things that we've done in the past that we need to reconcile. Uh, um, Economic justice. A person working a 40-hour work week should be able to afford their life. We've got
Yep.
places here in Missouri that uh, they actually bus people in to a factory job because the housing is so expensive. They bus people in from an entire other community in my district. Um, and it's things like that we have to fight to change. And I
Well,
appreciate guys like you that are getting that are at the top of the food chain or in the middle level of the food chain, but we've got to take care of we.
I don't, I don't know that any of us would say we're anywhere even on the food chain.
Yeah.
We're
Are you,
small fish in a big pond.
Yeah. In
But we
terms of oil
do
and gas, we're towards the bottom.
yeah,
but we
yeah.
do really
So
appreciate
so
you taking the
so.
time to sit here and
Mm,
talk with us and discuss
mm-hmm,
some of these issues. And
mm-hmm,
would encourage anyone else out there that wants to be part of this discussion to reach out to us, because these are issues that are not Republican or Democrat. They're not black and white. They're not, just affecting Americans or Europeans or Canadians. It's a global issue, and what we do here absolutely has an effect on the rest of the world. And
mm-hmm.
so these discussions are important. Uh, I I think that you were extremely open to some of our critiques on what we see from our side of the fence, and appreciate having the time to discuss those with you. And I think we're going to kind of wrap up here. Scott, did you have any kind of
No,
last additions
no,
on
I
that?
just same thing. I just want
Yep.
to thank you for coming on and being open, and again, anybody that's listening, and I'm sure I'll go find somebody on Twitter that I can get on the show that disagrees, and we'll just keep going. And that's kind of been my little personal mission, is just find as many people that are on the other side that should come on here and talk to us, and hopefully they're as open-minded as you are. And again, appreciate your time and your service, and
Yep.
thanks for being a public school teacher, because that's not an easy job, but good too. Yeah.
Has a lot of rewards. Thanks for your time, gentlemen. Everybody can stop by the website at henrymartinforcongress.com, look it up, and donate. We don't get people out of Washington that don't need to be there without having a good, solid campaign.
Yes,
So
sir.
thank
Yes,
you very
sir.
much for your time.
Okay. Happy Easter, you guys. See you later.
All right. Bye-bye,
Happy
guys.
Easter.